morning and welcome everyone to our December breakfast briefing called Raising Women's Political Voices. I'm Heidi Siegel and I've been Represent PA's Communication Director for the last 6 years. I'll be facilitating today's discussion, which features Dr. Kelly Dittmar, who has just released a new report from the Center for American Women in Politics titled Rethinking Women's Political Power. In addition, CAWP has also recently released another report called The Donor Gap, Raising Women's Political Voices. And we'll hear more from Kelly in a few minutes. First, today I'm going to share how CAWP's data correlates with Represent PA's experience since its inception in 2014. As donations have increased over the years, we've seen a substantial improvement in women's representation in our state legislature. And we've learned that the timing of donations is crucial to a woman candidate's success. But before we get going, I want to invite all of you to share in the chat, if you haven't already, where you're joining us from this morning. Additionally, for the majority of this discussion, if you have questions, please put them in the chat as well. My Represent colleagues will try and answer them, and if we don't get to them during the presentation, we'll try and get to them after Kelly's portion. We have set some time aside for Q&A. I want to begin today by sharing a piece of data from 2020, which I found in CAWP's report. It's this. In 2020 state legislative elections, the ones that Represent focuses on, women provided 32% of all individual contributions to all major party candidates in the general election that year. Men provided 68. There are a few reasons I think this is interesting. First, right now in Harrisburg, the percentage of women legislators versus men is the same split, 32 to 68. And it makes me wonder, if we donated more to women candidates, would more of them get elected? We can attest to the fact that there are enough women running, although there could always be more. When you look at this Represent PA data from the 2020 general election, you'll see that we had 68 Democratic women candidates get endorsed through our application process. Having endorsed all of them, those who ended up running lost, 35 of them lost, and 33 won. So of course we need more winners to change things in Harrisburg, and that's happening. It just may not be happening fast enough for us to realize the changes we're after. Let me remind you that there are currently over 100 bills that have passed the Democratic Pennsylvania House this year so far. And those same 100 or so bills remain stuck in the Republican-controlled PA Senate. In 2024, we have an opportunity to flip the Senate, and if we do, those changes we're after could be realized. And what we're talking about is reflective democracy. To achieve reflective democracy, meaning having our state legislature look like the population it represents, let me show you where Pennsylvania is compared to a leader in this effort, Nevada. This chart, which also comes from Kelly's latest report, shows Nevada with 54% of its state legislators as women, compared to where Pennsylvania was in 2020 with only 30%. We will do more work to examine these successful state examples. Another one out there I know of is Colorado. But in order to continue our work forward, we have to take a look at those success stories. Before we get too down on ourselves, though, I want to take a look at what has been working for Represent PA. First, our endorsement process. It is extensive and thorough, and we invite donors to join us in it. We collect candidate information from an application process where we're looking for values alignment and district win rate analysis for starters. Then we map that against insights from other like-minded organizations and partners, such as Emily's List and the PA, HD, and SDCCs. We also look at year-over-year data on districts and their partisan lean. This has resulted in a very thoughtful and careful investment in our endorsed candidates. Second is our investment strategy and our focus on early money. On this next slide, you'll see shades of blue and yellow. The key on the right shows you investment timings. You also see that cycle after cycle, we've been investing more of our donations earlier in the process. What that does to help our candidates is enable them to feel like they have a leg to stand on. For most women, making the decision to run isn't easy, and most also don't have the ability to self-fund their campaigns. Having money early means they can be relevant when discussions take place in local Democratic political organizations who may be deciding which candidates to back. Showing a bank account with money versus without money can sway a decision maker. It also helps candidates get their races off the ground. One story we like to share is how when we invested early in Senator Maria Collette's first race, she also had no money. But with our endorsement, she was able to create and mail 2 postcards early, and she claims this made the difference in her race and her victory. So that's where I'll stop for now and turn things over to Dr. Dittmar. Kelly's an associate professor of political science at Rutgers. She's the director of research and a scholar at CAWP, and her research focuses on gender and American political institutions, with a particular focus on how gender informs campaigns and the impact of gender diversity among elites in policy and political decisions, priorities, and processes. She's also authored 2 books listed here, as well as being an expert commentator for multiple media outlets. Kelly is going to share her own slides and take us through the latest data. Kelly, welcome.
Thanks so much, Heidi, and thanks all for being here in the morning, bright and early. Let me get my slides up. All right, so as Heidi mentioned, the Center for American Women in Politics is kind of known for keeping track of the data in terms of women's representation in elected office across states, across levels, across party, race, ethnicity. So I want to start with that, digging a little further deep down from the data that she showed, to give some detail about where we are today in terms of women's representation, as well as progress in recent years in Pennsylvania. And so I'm going to start with those data, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the research that Heidi alluded to about power, as well as money in politics, a very focused on this group's focus. So in terms of representation in the state legislature, as Heidi mentioned, women currently hold 32% of the seats in the Pennsylvania legislature. When you break it down by party, they are better represented in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. As you can see, about 36% of Democrats, 28% of Republicans, though it's notable in comparison to other states, is that actually we have in Pennsylvania less of a party gap, if you will, in women's representation than elsewhere. In terms of this level, this is a record high for women's representation in the legislature, so there is room to celebrate this, even though we're not at parity. And this is a really notable gain. So in the sense that if you look back in 2010, Pennsylvania ranked 46th in the nation for women's representation in the state legislature. Today, Pennsylvania ranks 26th. So obvious room for improvement, but it should give some credit to groups like Represent PA and others who are doing the work to try to move the needle forward. Moreover, if you look as a result of the 2022 election, there was a net gain of 5 women legislators, 3 of whom were Democrats, and 18 total non-incumbent women were successful in House or Senate races. And as you all know, those Democratic gains in particular were especially important in the House in contributing to the flip of the House from Republican to Democrat. So notable progress and milestones for women, even though there's room for continued growth. When we look at the congressional level, well, the statewide executive level, I'll come back to a little bit, but just to give the basic numbers, obviously women hold 2 of the 5 seats. Again, the party break, not as smaller numbers here, but one of 3 Democrats, one of 2 Republicans. And this is an area where across states, as well as within states, we want to see more growth. At the congressional level, again, you know the story of women's congressional gains in the past decade, most notably the success of women in the 2018 election. Today, women currently serving represent about 42% of all women who have ever served in Congress from Pennsylvania. So it's just a different way of looking at this data. In other words, that our current representation is near parity with what we've seen historically, a total number of 12 women serving in Congress from Pennsylvania. Again, all Democrats. When it comes to race and ethnicity, I obviously want to note it wasn't until 2023 that Pennsylvania sent its first woman of color, Representative Summer Lee, to Congress. And as you all likely also know, no woman of color has ever served in statewide elected executive office in our state. And so this is, again, a room for growth, and it demonstrates the more recent growth in particular and the challenges that are distinct to women of color in Pennsylvania politics. This chart shows the percentage of the population. This chart, sorry, is showing you the growth over time. So just seeing that benefit of recent years, seeing some gains again across different levels of office. And then this chart shows you the percentage of population that are women from diverse racial and ethnic groups. So women are underrepresented in every group, but you can see the stark underrepresentation of women of color in the state legislature, particularly Latina and Asian women. And to give, again, some historical context, just 2 Latinos have ever served in the Pennsylvania state legislature, and just 2 Asian women have ever served in the Pennsylvania legislature. Even Black women, whose numbers have absolutely increased over time, and we can't ignore the important leadership, of course, of Joanna McClinton, but even still, they continue to be underrepresented. So 25 Black women have ever served, compared to 132 white women who've ever served in the Pennsylvania legislature. In terms of Joanna McClinton's leadership, obviously that's notable in Pennsylvania for her historic leadership, but also nationwide. She's one of just 3 Black women and 8 total women who currently serve as speakers of state houses. And so I wanted to move a little bit beyond these data to talk about what we found in our report. So we did a report, as Heidi mentioned, called Rethinking Women's Political Power, that was focused on 5 different states, including Pennsylvania, to try to better understand what both contributed to gains in women's political power over the last decade, and also what the persistent challenges or hurdles are to those gains. And we were able to interview almost 200 individuals across those states, political actors, leaders, practitioners, candidates, to try to get a sense of where things stood and what the differences were as well across these state environments. And I saw a question in the chat about Nevada, and I'll be happy to talk about that. I think we'll have time in the Q&A about the differences between these states and why that might yield different outcomes. But I want to focus obviously here on Pennsylvania and what we found in the state. So in our interviews, interview subjects from Pennsylvania and other states really pointed to the gender and racial reckonings, especially since 2016, as contributing to climates in which women have been both more willing to run and also have been successful. And so here you actually see State Representative Emily Kincaid talking to me about the idea that she was ready to face all these barriers, right? Like she was ready for people to tell her like, oh, I don't know if you can win. And she said, what I actually ran into was the opposite in 2020. I was knocking on doors and people were like, thank God a woman is running. We need more women. I'm so excited to support you. So I think this is a good reminder that the foundation, right? The ground is shifting. It's softening for women, and also in some places can create opportunities based on the context. I think we'll see that as well going into 2024 in a lot of these discussions about reproductive rights and the value of women's voices being in these conversations in our state legislatures. That climate has also spurred engagement from women not running, but who have contributed to the support infrastructure available to women candidates, ranging from training programs like Ready to Run Pennsylvania, Emerge, to PACs like Represent PA that offer gender-targeted support. And so this is a long quote, but I'll get to the heart of it, which is basically an endorsement of the work that this group, that you all are doing, and the important value of Represent PA. So State Representative Donna Bullock said, you know, there's a lot of ways in which she works with this group, noting that sometimes she'll be calling and saying, hey, we need a little more help for this candidate to get over the line. And as Heidi mentioned, the importance of early money. And she also talked about how when she has extra funds that she can expend to candidates, she's going to look to the endorsement list of this group. So it's a really valuable reminder of how you build up this infrastructure to promote and support women, again, early on, but also when they, at whatever point they need it most to be successful financially. We also saw the value and a positive contributor of just role modeling. So Speaker Joanna McClinton, very optimistic. And we were talking to her before she became speaker. And she said, you know, we're going to see things change. She talked about her own journey and how she talks to women every day who are just inspired by seeing her at the podium. She said, we're going to be able to get more women of color, more women of diverse backgrounds elected as well. It's hard. We still have this patriarchal system, but we're providing a fresh start. And so I do think we're in this moment, especially in this state, where there are a lot of opportunities, optimistically, for where women can go in terms of their power and leadership. There have also been women in positions of political influence and power who have prioritized building political power outside of traditional party structures. So the white male dominance of party stakeholders and party aversion to quote unquote outsiders is more acute in certain parts of the state, as many of you know. In our interviews, office holders and practitioners, particularly in Northwest Pennsylvania, described explicit gatekeeping by male party leaders. And in the Southwest, the decision of the Allegheny County Democratic Committee in recent elections not to endorse multiple incumbent women office holders raised questions again about the degree to which partisan gatekeeping was a function of both gender and race, or at least influenced by these things. So one state party leader argued, no, you know, this is much more about new generations, relationships, networks, etc. But when we interviewed her in June 2022, U.S. Representative Summer Lee, who both won her state and congressional contest without that backing, really described that party organization particularly as a deterrent to newcomers, including those who might better represent the communities they serve. And so you saw her and other Democratic women in particular build their own alternative sites for political power, for getting financial support, for mobilizing voters. And so now you see somebody like a Representative Kincaid even getting to the point of electing other committee members who can better build that organization in a way that's supportive of new and diverse voices. So again, you know, there's a lot of positive stories to tell about women's leadership in the state. And they need greater support. They need support and engagement in all forms, from voters, activists, donors, et cetera, to be able to take on what are really deeply rooted structures that can often determine political success or defeat. So then we want to talk about continued hurdles. So beyond pushing past these kind of dominantly white and male gatekeepers, the individuals we interviewed pointed to persistent barriers like a general conservatism in the state. And so many of you know Dana, the head of executive director of the Center for Women in Politics in the state at Chatham. You know, and she talked about conservatism not in an ideological sense, but this perception that women, and especially women of color, are less likely to win. And this really gets to the challenge and the dearth of seeing women at those highest levels, the Senate race, the statewide races, et cetera. And so this has been especially challenging. And Dana noted that it contributes to a sort of electability bias against women candidates who we haven't seen in some of these positions. So she said, while I believe political parties are doing what they believe best to diversify the whole system does suffer from the idea that Pennsylvania voters at large are more conservative and therefore have certain expectations about, for example, what statewide candidates may look like or believe in, et cetera. And so these sorts of implicit biases came up in a lot of our interviews. We talked to Representative Houlihan or Congresswoman Houlihan, who said, that's still a persistent challenge that she faces. Again, these kind of older ideas of who can or should be successful. Of course, in contrast, the recent success of women, especially in statewide judicial contests, challenges those electability biases and again makes the case that women are not only important to be candidates, but also are some of the best candidates and the most successful candidates in recent elections. We've seen in terms of continued hurdle, also some things that folks raised is, how do you build power for women outside of some of these Democratic strongholds? So outside of a Pittsburgh, outside of a Philadelphia, how do you create support infrastructure in these other communities throughout Pennsylvania? We've also seen continued challenges of the culture, not just in the state, but within the legislature. Again, we were doing most of our interviews before Speaker McClinton took over, so we should note that. But even at the time, talking in 2022, women talked about the loneliness, especially for women of color, and we heard this on both sides of the aisle. Here again, Representative Bullock kind of demonstrates the particular feeling of being underrepresented and underappreciated as a Black woman in the state legislature. She says, when institutions have been male dominated for so long, the culture becomes that as well. I see my newly elected male colleagues quickly make friends all the way up to the speaker, again, at the time of men, and other folks because they're part of that old boys network. She's like, you just got here and everybody knows your name, but there's only 9 of us Black women members and they can't get our names right. Again, I expect and believe and know from just some more conversations we've had since then that there is positive change with the change in women and high levels of leadership, but these cultures are really stubborn, right? It doesn't just change overnight or simply because you get more women in office. And so lastly, I think a hurdle is the need to build that support infrastructure, particularly to address financial hurdles. And these financial hurdles of public service are not just the money you need to run, though absolutely it is, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but it's also the cost of serving and running on a personal level. And so Representative Summer Lee told us about, the ability to run for office, particularly when she's talking about running for the state legislature for the first time. She said, I was living with my mom. She allowed me to do this because she saw potential. She allowed me to not pay rent because she thought it was an investment in the future. And she said there are so many Black girls who aren't able to make long-term investments in their future because they have to make short-term decisions for their livelihood. And we heard this time and again, not just in Pennsylvania, but across our states of study, which is like the cost of even just the opportunity cost of running, losing a salary, having to put time and money into the campaign that might be your own is a real challenge. And then, of course, the cost of actually winning. In a state as large as Pennsylvania with multiple major media markets, partisan competitiveness, the financial cost of waging and winning a successful statewide campaign is especially high for anyone. When former U.S. Representative Allison Schwartz and Katie McGinty ran for the Democratic nomination to be governor, for example, and we're talking back in 2014, but they were significantly outspent by somebody who could self-fund up to $10 million. Women are less likely to self-fund. That's what our research and other research continues to show. And money is not just important for addressing, of course, campaign costs, but as Christine has shared with us, money is the commodity that people use to judge electability. So it's not just only important to get that money because obviously you need to expend it on the campaign trail, but it's also a way to prove that you are serious and that then there are other donors, other PACs, the party, other folks should get out there and endorse and support you as well. And again, this goes back to Heidi's points about the extreme value of early money and the value of work that groups like yours do to try to ensure that that money gets in the hands of candidates and they can then leverage that for additional support. One thing we emphasize in the report is that representation doesn't automatically mean power. Building power requires building out sites and types of power that go beyond just getting women in elected office. And I know that largely here, we're going to talk about the focus, obviously, of supporting candidates and getting them to be successful. But we know that once they're in office, we want to make sure that they have leadership positions like Speaker McClinton, right? Out of office, we want to look and make sure that we're getting women in positions of party leadership. Those are often spaces where we see gatekeeping. So we need more folks in those positions who will understand and value that diversity of leadership. Those folks are also really important to recruitment and support, as are practitioners, political consultants, lobbyists, et cetera, who often have influence of who parties will select and who they will support. Other unelected influencers may be political staff, many of whom go on to run for office, industry leaders, corporate PAC folks, right? And so these were all the areas where when we asked in our report, where else do we need to get women? These were all sites where we repeatedly were repeatedly referenced, and we agree are equally important to ensure that we're getting women in those positions of power and influence in our political systems. And that's true in Pennsylvania as it is in many other states. But donors are also on this list. So giving to politics is an axis of political power. It is an act of political power as well. Donors, again, help to determine viability of candidates, often for all of these other powerful folks that I mentioned. And so former ED of the Pennsylvania Democratic Party and a consultant now, Jason Robert Henry, said to us, unless you have a lot of money to be able to get known around the state, major donors are going to go with the folks that they know. And I think this is kind of where the Old Boys Club comes in. And that's absolutely true because, as Heidi said, the donor class has been dominated by men in Pennsylvania and across the country. And so if donors are determining viability, and they're also determining whether or not a candidate can be successful, we need to ensure that there are more women in their ranks. So I do want to give a few points from this research, and I want to cite my colleague, Kira Sambamatsu, who is the author and main primary investigator of this report, and it's called The Donor Gap. I put it in the chat, and I'll do so again during our discussion. But here she finds that men give a disproportionate amount of all money directly contributed to candidates. So this particular chart is over time. So it's from 2019 to 2022. Women made up no more than a third of general election campaign donors across all state level contests. And you can see here the breakdown by different levels of office. Women were also responsible in terms of Pennsylvania. Women were responsible for 35% of contributions in state level general elections just in 2022. So slightly above the average, which is great, probably due to some of the work done here, but obviously, again, room for growth. Women are over 50% of the population. Their political voice that is expressed through money should at least be at that level. Men are also the majority of political donors. So if you just look at the aggregate, how many donors are there, right? The first is based on percent of contributions, and this is percent of donors. They range anywhere, women range anywhere from about 44% to 48% of state election donors in this period. Again, in 2022, they were 46% of donors in PA general elections. Again, not bad. But when it comes to that disparity in actual size of donations, that's particularly significant. And while women donors give disproportionately to women, they are most likely to give to Democratic women meaning they serve as an especially valuable base of donors for Democratic women candidates. And lastly, women candidates are more reliant on men on contributions, and particularly individual level small contributions. And they are less likely to self-fund, as I mentioned earlier. So in our report, the new report on power, we offer a series of prescriptions for progress, which I hope you'll take a look at. But among them, and particularly relevant to the work of Represent PA, is building a more robust support infrastructure for women in politics, including access to financial resources. And that means increasing and exercising women's political power as donors, and then leveraging that support and power to motivate women candidates, including those who stand apart from the white and male-dominated party and political institutions that can present those hurdles to power. So I hope those of you on the call not only consider this kind of axis of power for yourself, the way in which you can exercise it, but encourage others to activate that power as well to move the needle for women in politics in the state. And I will stop there because I'm happy to take questions and talk more with you all.
If it's okay, I think we're going to move a few more slides forward on our represent angle, and then open up for everybody to ask questions. So thanks so much, Kelly, and I appreciate, first of all, one of my favorite quotes from the report is one that you just shared from Rep. Bullock, because she's such a great unofficial spokesperson for Represent PA. And she's also my state rep, and she's a really good friend of mine. So it's nice to see her speaking highly of us. Also, having read through Kelly's report, one of the things I liked most was the section on prescriptions. And this section lists several ways that we can all take action on these findings. This is important to me because when I read something that could potentially make me feel sad or hopeless, these prescriptions offer suggestions for how to make change, and then I get re-energized, and I hope everyone else on this call does too. I pulled out a few of the prescriptions that Kelly just referenced. I feel that Represent is already working on some of these. These are listed on the left-hand side, and I also listed a few that I think we need to consider for the work that we're doing to keep our progress and our success moving forward. So the first one I wanted to highlight on the left is one that I think we're already doing. It's the third one down. Increase attention to an amplification of the success and impact of women political leaders. We're doing this by featuring legislators regularly in these breakfast briefing events, also by sharing their profiles with you in our newsletters, inviting them to speak at our fundraisers, featuring them on our website, in our blog, and on our social media accounts. We're proud of the work these women are doing, and we want them and you to know it. The next one I'll highlight is on the right-hand side, one that we started doing and need to do more of, which is create competition for established gatekeepers to motivate action to address gender and racial ethnic disparities. This is also one Kelly pointed out. Currently, Represent has some well-established relationships with some of the organizations I mentioned earlier, like Emily's List, NPA's HD and SDCC. These relationships have actually afforded us levels of access that we wouldn't have had in the past, particularly our executive director, Christine, and our political director, Meg. This access has included insider information on candidate selections, and in one example with the HD and SDCC, where there was a need to hire a new executive director for the SDCC, we were invited to participate in those interviews. So we're also now connected to the SDCC and able to influence certain incumbent male senators to support potential women candidates who are considering a run in 2024, which could not only help flip the Senate to D, but also increase the number of women senators overall. Another way to move away from potential feelings of gloom and doom is on this slide, which represents success and the part we've been playing in helping to improve our numbers in Harrisburg, increasing our influence and seeing more of all of us reflected in the elected women representing us. So here you'll see our growth in fundraising over the election cycles. And with that growth came an increase in both the number of elected Democratic women legislators and our overall percentage of women legislators in Harrisburg. This is something we're very proud of and will need your help and support, including donations, to continue. So with that bit of good news, I will open up now for anybody who has any questions for either the Represent team or for Kelly.
I think you're muted, Pat.
There, thank you, sorry. Giving to women politically is an act of defiance against the status quo. And I have found that it's one of the most positive things I can do for my mood. When I hear all the news that we hear about the national circumstances, I know I'm doing something that is combating that. And it's just remarkable how good it feels.
That's great. It's therapy.
It's therapy.
Should we call him Peggy?
Thank you. I want to highlight Judy Chin's question in the chat because I'm interested in the answer. How do you know who the motivating donor is?
Yeah.
And how is that teased out if the donation doesn't come singularly? You know, if a donation came from Mark Kerchak or Mark and Peggy Kerchak, how would you know that that wasn't really Peggy Kerchak's donation?
Yeah.
And I love the question.
Yeah, great question. And this is something that absolutely comes up. So the data, the data for this donor gap report and the overall the data points that I showed you, they come from Open Secrets. So many of you will be aware in this space that Open Secrets is often used as the main primary source, kind of like we are in terms of women's representation. They are a primary source for donor and campaign finance data. And so on their website, you can find like an incredible amount of information. We worked with them in terms of using their data and crediting their data, but doing it with intention to look at this these gender differences. I don't want to answer out of line on this one because this is my colleague Kira's research. When I previously worked with this data, this was an absolute issue where there were joint donors. They were either, the researcher had to make a call about to either pull those out. In other words, they're not coded as male or female, right? They're coded as a joint of some sort. And so it doesn't factor into the number. Or it would be if there was any indication of a primary donor, though, as you noted, most of the time it's just a joint situation. So I don't know the answer about how Kira dealt with it in the report and maybe in the methodology, and I should have read that closer before I got on with you all. But it is, I will just say to you all on a more like practical note, it is a challenge. And if we want to make the case of, just having more women in office, those individual donations to the degree that individuals can make it as, a donation from me, and then maybe a husband donates separately. It is for at least accounting purposes here, like in terms of making the case that we're seeing gains in women donors, that would be valuable as well. And I think one last thing I'll say is that historically, I don't know that this is true anymore, but when I was doing research on this in like 2010, and I was working with the folks at Open Secrets, they were saying that too often insiders like the gatekeepers, et cetera, even the campaign folks would take a joint donation and assume the male was making the decision and would appeal to the man, right? Or that male spouse, because that's what they assumed based on a joint donation, even though I think many of us here probably know that that's not necessarily the case. I hope that we've seen some change in that, but you all may know better, honestly, from your own experiences and working in this space, if that has changed.
Another indication of this, though, in the same trend, at least historically, was that the difference in giving to male universities that only have male students and universities that have female students.
Mm.
And universities with male students, the male alumni are much bigger givers than the universities with women alumni who, and so women give less to universities, and that is spread. They may have the same accounting problem in general, but when you look at alums of university and you can assign a dollar amount to an alum, even at co-ed universities, men give a lot more money to their universities than women do.
Well, and I think, Christine, and that speaks to like a broader challenge and trend, which is women tend to give more, right, to what they deem as philanthropic. And it's interesting because universities could kind of fall in some sort of a middle road there, but
right.
that men have historically been more politically like strategic about donations in the way that obviously like donate to a candidate, they realize the value that is a form of political voice. We could all have conversations about whether that's good or bad, but that's the world we live in. But we see women when we've done past surveys, not at CAWP, other great folks who have done these surveys, right? Where women are much more likely to say, well, I'm going to give to the food bank, or I'm going to raise money for this issue. And they don't necessarily see the candidate as the issue. And I know that Represent and other groups do a good job of messaging to say, no, this is the issue, right? Like these women are gonna, by electing these women, you're gonna move forward. But I think that messaging is still something we need to do more of, with women than we do with men because of just their thinking about how they give.
And here's a small example of that. Early on in our processes, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I was talking to a woman who all of her philanthropic efforts went into the work she did with her child in local elementary schools. And she was raising $50,000, $70,000 to build a new playground at her child's school.
Right.
And because that was an immediate thing that she could focus on. And we had a discussion about, well, why don't you, with $50,000 or $70,000 raised, we could buy another state rep office and we could end up with more money for all schools. And it's just, and so I don't mean to put down that particular woman, but I'm just saying that that's the difference in the strategic thinking of getting to the point where you're changing the universe as opposed to changing things that are immediate. And women have given more money immediately.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'll just reference the Nevada question that came up in the chat. I know that Christine, you pretty much answered it, but I just wanted to make this point and kind of hammer it home. So we looked at 5 states. We looked at Georgia, Illinois, Nevada, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania. It's absolutely true that the reason we did that and why it's so important is because there are different dynamics in each of those states in terms of things like how much do state legislators make? How often do they meet? So what are these structural challenges for them to serve and even to run, right? How much does it cost to win an election in Oklahoma versus Pennsylvania? And so, Nevada gets a lot of credit for being the first, and it should get credit for being the first majority women legislature. But part of the reason we wanted to study Nevada is to say, well, hold on a second. What is that? Why? And also, what does that mean in practice? And what we found was just a great reminder that simply having majority women, right, is not the goal, end all be all goal in and of itself. That so much of it is ensuring that those women are in positions of power and in institutions of power. And so in Nevada, unfortunately, the least powerful political institution is arguably the state legislature. And so the more powerful institution is the Clark County Commission, right, which controls all of Las Vegas. And on that commission, there is one woman of 7 members. And so in Pennsylvania now, we know the state legislature is very powerful, right? And so that it is important to be and have women in that space. And there are other spaces in Pennsylvania we want to look at as well to ensure that women are in those positions and they are supported. And then it speaks to one other thing, which is the challenge of what it costs to be a legislator. And in Pennsylvania, we have a much better salary for our state legislators, but you all know and have seen the news, especially when we think about the midnight what do we call that scandal? The pay scandal. But, like they also are challenged to raise their salaries because voters often push back against that, but that means that certain people can't run and serve potentially. And so we just have to be cognizant of that, I think, on the financial side as well, that there are costs that are both real and then opportunity costs of public service.
Well, and the thing that you mentioned, though, that triggered me, and that is there are states where the governor is the dominant force, and whatever the governor wants can get done. Pennsylvania is not one of those states, but that is not widely recognized by Pennsylvania voters. And so over the decades, we have flipped, and you've seen us flip. We have a Republican governor, then we have a Democratic governor for 2 terms, and we have this time where we had a Democrat succeed a Democrat was monumental, because for the most part, we've had one succeed the other and nothing gets done. And people are saying, hey, how come minimum wage isn't up? How come we're not doing this? How come we're doing that? We changed governors. How come he's not getting it done? It's because the governor doesn't have the power in Pennsylvania. And over the decades, we've had Republican leadership in both the House and the Senate. And that's why some of this more populist legislation, the people thought the governor had control of. He does not. And and so much of the power in this state is with the legislature.
So important.
It's my commercial.
Love it. Karen. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
What about Colorado? I think I remember seeing that was a state with high numbers of women.
Yes. So Colorado has historically been higher. They've had majority women chambers. And so another state that has hit that kind of milestone that often a lot of us talk about. So we didn't do the case study in Colorado, so I don't want to claim, but we're obviously familiar. We've been kind of watching and working with Colorado women legislators for a long time. I would just say, at least somewhat more anecdotally, that both of those states, one of the striking things about Nevada, to give them lots of credit, is there are really strong networks of women. And it includes women who are now out of office. It's a state with term limits, so there are more women out of office, right, that have that continue to support the candidates and the women in office. And so every woman we spoke to in Nevada talked about there is a culture here of women supporting women, of women normalizing women's leadership. In other words, like saying, like, we just expect there to be half women on the, recruitment of the House caucus or the Senate caucus. Like, this is normal now. My sense is that in Colorado, there has been a similar dynamic, that there has been such a high level of women's leadership, especially at the state legislative level, for a long time, that you've created this kind of robust network. And it's one thing that we didn't really put this in our prescriptions, but I think is valuable. Sometimes when women get out of office, many of them come back, and you've all probably heard this. They're like, we're happy to help. Like, what do you want us to do? And folks just kind of like, oh, well, they're out of office. They don't have any power. They don't, have any influence. I think there is a population of women who've been in positions of political power who maybe aren't anymore, but who could help to continue to build these networks and support other women behind them. Again, we see that in the state. I mean, we talk about, although she's still in positions of power, but somebody like Congresswoman Dahl Kemper, who's been doing work in the state, in her particular region, to try to build and support women in politics. And so I think we see some of that in Pennsylvania, but we could probably see it more. And those states seem to have built a more unified and robust kind of network of women to support other women. And again, normalize that leadership in the institutions.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions?
Hi, it's Judy Chin. It's not really a question. It's just kind of more general information, not specific to this presentation. But I signed on to one of these in 2020. My neighbor was going to host an event and everything was shut down. So I don't know if it was the first Zoom, but it was a Zoom presentation. And it was where I first learned about the importance of women in our legislature and how few we had. And I see we have a lot more now, just 3.5 years later. So that's really great. Ever since I got involved, I have become a poll worker and I work for getting out the vote. So I was wondering what this group does in terms of getting out the vote after you have your candidates lined up. And the second part of that is, after I got involved, I get so many emails and texts from so many different Democratic organizations. I lose track of who's who and what's what, and I don't really know where to put my money.
Well, I'll answer that. First of all, you put your money with us. So, okay, so because you know it's going to be, the candidates will be curated and it'll go to the parts of the state and to the candidates who can do the best job. For example, this time we're going to have, if it ends up being, you know, women candidates in a seat in Erie and a seat in Allegheny County for state senate, and those seats could bring us to a 50-50 tie. We're going to tell you to, you know, where to give money there. In terms of, and we curate the candidates for you. So just the way it is. But in terms of other, we view that there are a lot of different lanes in this political world. And Emily's List, for example, in Pennsylvania has a presence, but they don't really fund candidates at this level in Pennsylvania. What they do, you know, except for a few $1,000s, you know, very small amounts. But what Emily's List does is they talk to the candidates, they help them find campaign leaders, the fundraisers and that kind of thing. So that's their lane in this process. There's other the caucuses are helping to find candidates. We don't go out and recruit candidates. If somebody comes to us, we refer to them to either the House or the Senate campaign committee, because those are the people who vet the candidates. Vince Hughes heads it up for the Senator Vince Hughes on the Senate side, and oh, somebody help me, in Bucks County, Tina Davis heads it up for the House Democratic side. And so we don't vet candidates. Emerge does training. And we also, you mentioned Dana's group in Western PA that does candidate training. And Emily's List does some candidate training on a broader basis. We don't do candidate training. And we also don't do GOTV, the get out the vote efforts. But what we do is highlight these various organizations. So we've had the head of Red Wine and Blue from Pennsylvania on our calls. Closer to the election, we'll have more of the people on. We'll highlight what are the efforts and who's doing the get out the vote efforts in various parts of the state and where there are opportunities. I'm assuming there's going to be some kind of encampment of strong-minded women in Erie in the fall, for example, to go door to door and make sure everybody hears from whoever the Senate candidate is, that kind of thing. But that's not our lane, and that just doesn't. And what I like is that there are a lot of different organizations who don't try and do everything for everybody. We try and figure out who's doing what, and we'll make you aware of those. And in terms of the email, oh, I'm sorry, I get them too. I usually answer all the texts with a stop, because I hate getting, you know, text messages. That's for my kids and, you know, pictures of my grandchildren. That is not for random candidate in a different part of this country. Does that answer your question? Did we lose Judy?
No, I'm here. I was trying to unmute.
Yeah.
You answered many questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I could jump in, one thing that we found, which I think exactly to Christine's points about all the different groups that are doing this work, which is a really positive sign in Pennsylvania. One thing we saw in Georgia that we put in the report as kind of like maybe more states could do this. They kind of built a recruitment and support table. In other words, they brought together the PACs and the training orgs, et cetera, and they would meet on a regular basis during elections to just compare notes. And so I think that is happening, like as Christine mentioned, in Pennsylvania, just by her and others in the organization having relationships. that are important with these other groups. So you can refer folks. But there is even, there are examples of even more formalized ways to build those coalitions that I think could get at some of this, to what Judy's point about, once you get the candidates in there, you get them the support. How do you get out the vote? Well, that's another organization's work, absolutely. But how do you make sure that they're supporting the Rep PA candidates, again, as you're already doing, but there are good examples of the value of coalition building there.
We do some of that in Pennsylvania. Both the House and the Senate caucus bring together all of the various turnout groups like us, but like I mentioned, Red, Wine, and Blue, or Turn PA Blue, or some of the other groups. We do, once we get closer to having candidates in the elections, there are periodic meetings of those groups to talk about candidates and who's doing what and what the efforts are. We also have a state table that pulls people together periodically, and I participate in that. And Meg who's our political director, also participates in that. So we do have some of that, but it's a question of then how does that carry out? What are the, for people like you all, how do you find out what's going on? And that's what we will do more of that in the fall, of making sure that our donors and our friends hear about other groups also.
Okay, well, we're almost at time. So the one last thing I wanted to wrap up with today is certainly that before you leave us, remember that women supporting women is the way we are all successful, and women donating to women-focused organizations like ours gives us all more political power and helps our voices be heard. So please consider a donation to Represent PA. We need to be able to continue to support strong women candidates in 2024, particularly and urgently, and then beyond that. So thank you very much today. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to Dr. Dittmer for being here and sharing all of her data insights, and hope that all of you have a wonderful day.